Got it.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whichever time zone you're in. This is Frank Niepold. I am the Clean co-chair, and I am starting my presentation just so we can get this listening session. Did I go to the right one? Do you guys see the slides there?
Yep.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to present. So, just for everyone's, we're going to get started here. Again, my name is Frank Niepold. I'm the Climate Education Senior Program Manager and Coordinator at NOAA's Climate Program Office. And today is, I think, 5th or 6th listening session in this sequence that the Clean Network is supporting on Action for Climate Empowerment. We're looking at building a strategic plan. We think the nation needs this. We think, as a community. And this is where we're getting into the planning, and we're doing 3 consecutive informal community-based education listening sessions. Is the second of the 3. And the final one will be coming up in August. And then we'll move on to other parts of the ACE space. So just to remember, we are recording this for community reflection. If you want to change your name, how it is listed, both that relates to the chat transcript, but also if you want to go anonymous, you can change your name. If you don't want to be recorded, you can leave and watch this as a recording. But just want to make sure that you have that option. As we're moving forward on this process of building an ACE national strategy, for those who don't know, we'll get in a little bit more in a second. But we believe that it is really critical that there be a justice, inclusion, and respect dimension to it. How we approach that in this work, because we're a big, complicated country, and ACE is a massive space in how climate-related work supports climate action. So, but as we're building a strategy, this means that it has to work for all constituencies, all peoples, all communities, and all types of education or training or public engagement. So we want to be as inclusive and respectful in that process. It's just an important reflection on how we operate. So today, we have a esteemed panel, and it's going to be a large panel. So when we get into the time, we're going to try and get there quickly. But Kristen Dorgello, did I get that right, Kristen? Or did I botch that completely?
Oh, don't worry about it. It's Dorgello. Hi, everybody.
Dorgello. As a former classroom teacher, there's always one student that has a name that I always screwed up. Well, Kristen, welcome to the club. So, President and CEO of Aztec, Curtis Bennett, from the Director of Equity and Community Engagement from National Aquarium in Baltimore, Jeremy Hoffman, Chief Scientist for the Science Museum of Virginia, Jen Kretzer, the Director of Climate Initiatives for the Wild Center up in the Adirondacks, David Sittenfeld, Manager of Forums and National Collaborations for the Museum of Science in Boston, and then Billy Spitzer, the principal. Are you the principal investigator or former principal investigator?
Yeah, I guess former works. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't caught that detail yet, but former principal investigator for NOKI, and former vice president of learning and community at the New England Aquarium. So this is an awesome panel. So we're going to try and get to what you guys have to say related to this protocol we've got. This is a process that we've launched as a community. This is a general timeline. I updated this a little bit this morning, but this is really starting to pick up. We believe that an ACE national strategy is something that is important. As a country, we're supposed to have done this in 2015. That's when the mandate came out of the UN process through something called the Doha Work Program. We've not taken this up, and we've been looking at it for a couple of years, but now we feel that it is really high time that we look at the intersection of how education, training, public access, public participation, and public awareness relate to advancing climate solutions and actions. We think as a community that we play a critical role, but it's a we action as opposed to an individual, everyone doing their own ad hoc work. So as we look through this is from the UN process, this guide, this graphic, And you look at it, we've done a lot of these things as a community in different ways, in different order, but it doesn't, the details don't matter here, but we think that there's a robustness to our work as how we work in climate in this country. Now we need to actually come up with a unifying strategy. So this conversation is really about unearthing kind of where are we, what do we know, what should be considered as we move forward in this process. So one of the things that I thought was really important work that was done previously under the National Science Foundation funded Climate Change Education Partnership Alliance was a framework of what are the priority audiences. We've been working in this space robustly since 2008, 7, something like that. And as we've done more work, we've expanded more priority audiences. We've explored new modalities, done really important work. We're still doing that. That's not and that process isn't ended. But there are some really important audiences that emerged. And over time, we continue to do that. We're going to be moving these into a series of online dialogues starting August 6th. You can see some of the pathway elements line up with the priority audiences, line up with the UN framework. But here at this event, if you haven't already tracked this, is where we're going to launch the event and really start digging in much more deeply into the strategies and elements that should be prioritized in a national strategy. We're going to start with a framework because we don't have the convening authority and authorization of an administration to do this. But we think that doing this legwork will establish a really solid foundation for how that would work. So here's the session. And I'm trying to get to this as fast as possible because we have a lot to talk about. Wow, I'm actually doing okay. That was fast, probably too fast. But we're gonna go through the introductions, which I'm just wrapping up now. We'll have a panel discussion. We've been using the same protocol for all of these listening sessions. It's just something called a semi-structured interview protocol, just same questions modified through different people. We haven't gotten to questions yet. So if we can manage those in the chat, if you have under normal clean network calls, again, we've had weekly clean network calls since 2008, still a stunning accomplishment. But if you have anything you want to announce, any questions or queries you want to bring to the community, then you can do that through the chat window. Who's facilitating that today? Is that you, Don?
Yes, that's me. Awesome.
So Don will facilitate that. Last time we did this, we had like over 99 comments flowing through there. It was a very rich comment space, and we'll be looking at those after. So if you have any comments, thoughts that you want to put into this conversation, just use the chat so that the panelists and I will have a facilitated conversation, and hopefully we'll have time for questions, but we haven't done it yet. So we'll see.
Yeah, and please introduce yourself in the chat if you haven't as yet. I think most have.
Thank you, Don. That's exactly right. So let's get into it, right? So clearly, one of the areas that is important to how communities build capacity, understanding, awareness, and engagement is through informal, community-based learning. It's shown up across our work. So digging into this with a lot of people who've been dealing and leading in this space is really what this panel is about. Informal, non-formal, community-based, culturally based, however you want to name it, there's a couple names, is critical here. So we're going to focus on the engagement side of that today. So your opening question, and the way this works for a panelist is, if you have something to offer, just speak up. I'm not going to be calling on people. There's not going to be an order. Feel free to speak openly. And we're going to go through these. And the opening question is, why is informal, community-based climate education key for supporting climate actions? That's the opening question. These are two pictures, one from David Sittenfeld's work that NOAA funded in Boston on community forums. And then the second picture is from some of the work Jeremy Hoffman and NOAA have been doing on community-based urban heat mapping. So these are just two examples, but there's so many more I could have chosen. So today I just wanted to kind of get into that opening question. Why is informal, community-based climate education key for supporting climate actions? Floor is open.
This is
Kristen.
David. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kristen. You first.
Oh, thanks, David. I'm happy to jump in, and I'm really excited about the fellow panelists who participate so directly in informal community-based climate education. I think looking field-wide, you know, the organizations and institutions that lead informal community-based climate education are not just science museums, they're not just after-school programs, there's a rich ecosystem of community-based programs and institutions of a wide variety of types that are a support system for local engagement on climate issues. So I think the why of it for me is deep national and international reach, but very specific local community relationships. So an ability to take climate as a concept and, you know, climate data and information generally, and make them tangible, specific, and based in community values and priorities. So really building from community priorities and community questions backwards to what information would be helpful in navigating those issues at that local level. So I think you've assembled a group of individuals, including David, who is going to pop in, who are doing that work on a daily basis and trying different models that can be replicated in additional communities. So there's also the asset of experimentation and collective learning about learning and engagement models that are effective to motivate action toward climate issues. So David, over to you, who you do such impressive work.
Thanks so much, Kristen. I'm glad you went first. That was great. I think I would add to what Kristen said that, you know, policies to address this sort of grand challenge for our world and our society are going to impact everyone. And so many people are currently just unengaged in the discussion about how to build resilience or sort of mitigate this problem. There are a lot of strong voices that we read and hear, but a lot of people just aren't involved in the discussion. And so I think informal community-based climate education of the kinds that the folks that are on this panel are doing is really important for bringing these unengaged voices to the conversation in sort of an informed and inclusive and respectful way, so that those perspectives are represented, both to catalyze agency among those groups and making them understand that we all have a role to play in making these decisions and sharing our voices and our perspectives, but also because any proposed climate policies are going to be improved with the input of those people. So that their sort of perspectives about what they think about anything that's proposed is informed by their perspectives and their decisions. And so science centers and other informal science education institutions have a role to play through the capacities that Kristen was talking about in translating difficult, complex ideas and activating diverse public audiences.
Yep, great points. Others?
Yeah, this is, oh, go ahead, Curtis.
So just to jump in, you know, just to build off what's already been said, I think it's even taking a step back and thinking about the term and concept of community, understanding that that is a very loaded term and something that is looked at it in many different scales. So in one sense, you can look at it from a geographic standpoint and understand that different geographical areas are impacted differently. You can also look at it from, say, an interest or an affinity perspective to understand that different groups, say the faith community, the fishing community, the sports community, you know, all these different interest groups are also being impacted in different ways as a result of climate change. And then you get into things like identity, so your demographics. And this is incredibly important because, especially when we're talking about systemic inequities, you can have a similar geography, even a similar interest group, and then you start getting into some of the demographics, and that's where you start to maybe see some of those more systemic inequities coming up. And we have to be intentional in how we're addressing those for these very specific, unique audiences. And making sure that those voices are at the forefront of the narrative, that the education or the learning is a two-way street. Because as professionals in this field, we have to learn. We have to understand, you know, what's relevant, what's important, the language that we use. So even something I think about a lot is even the term resilience. How does that resonate? Does it resonate? You know, so we have to, you know, really engage in that two-way street learning process, especially within that broader community framework.
Curtis, those are really important points. I really appreciate you making them because you're spot on. So let's keep going. Billy, you had something more to build on?
I would just add to all the really great comments so far that you know, I think the definition of community is a really important point to think through, and but I guess what I think about is the kind of the scale at which people actually do engage and interact with one another. And I think one asset that is present in a lot of the country is there are various kinds of organizations, whether they're called community organizations or they're faith-based organizations or they're interest-based or whatever they are. There are these associations that, you know, Tocqueville wrote about, you know, hundreds of years ago that are really important places where the work of participatory democracy actually happens. And it's where social capital exists and is built. It's where people interact with one another, talk with one another, negotiate with one another. And it's where a lot of the engagement is today on important issues, which may or may not for many groups include climate on the list. But that is the, you know, where that's kind of the granularity where the impact happens. And so I think there's a really important need to acknowledge that, you know, most of people's lives is not in school, it's outside of school. And in our society, the opportunities to interact with other people around important social, political, environmental, you know, issues in common is really at this community scale and this organizational level. And there is a lot of variation in that texture of what kinds of organizations there are and who's involved and how big and what their purposes are. But unless we understand that ecosystem really well, which exists kind of alongside and interacts with the political system and the economic system, unless we really understand it, engage with that level of society, we're not going to really have the lasting impacts that we want to have.
Right. Jen or Jeremy, do you want to build on that? Jen?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things I think about in looking at this question and hearing everyone's very thoughtful comments is around the relationship building that many informal community-based, you know, organizations like science centers, for example, or other museums have the ability to make, because they do oftentimes sit in this as a trusted, seen as a trusted organization with deep connections to their communities in the place where they're located. So how those relationships are built and the authenticity of those relationships, I think, is really key to supporting any kind of work that's going to work on climate solutions or build on climate solutions in communities, and whether those are relationships with schools or social justice groups or with the New York, like for us in New York State, like working with the Climate Smart Communities program, like any of those things, like those, that's all about relationship. And so how do we continue to build relationships that are real and authentic and long-term, and that there's some long-term sustainability there.
Gotcha. Thank you, Jen. Jeremy, you have anything else you want to add here?
I have so very little to add beyond what my esteemed colleagues have already been able to put together. And I think it goes along with what Curtis was saying. I think, and I saw a question in the chat from Katie Boyd asking about kind of like how do, you know, predominantly white privileged institutions like science centers, you know, become involved in the community. And it does fall back on what Jen just got done saying about relationship building. And what I think the science centers in each place have not only their own local context climatologically, but also in order to like fund and transfer resources and into community organizations that might already be working in this space in some way or another. So in the case of the Heat Island picture, which actually that's also Boston's work on the right side, Frank.
It's Boston.
Yeah, so David, that's 100% Museum of Science.
Yeah, there it is. I see the logo.
But what we've seen with this is through that program of bringing together community organizations to do a community-based heat island assessment, for example, is then you start to brainstorm ways that funding avenues from different scales, both like local, state, national, federal, to like different types of funding, like urban agriculture is actually green infrastructure and all these sorts of things. The Science Center can be kind of that nexus point for all that information to get digested and then actually have some of the resources and use that power and privilege to then funnel resources into the community that they're seeking to serve.
Gotcha. Well, let's dig into we did the why, now the how. Right. And unfortunately, these questions as this protocol has been worked through, it gets a little bit wonky. So just bear with me here. But the how can, as we've described, informal, community-based, work to engage. And I really like this word engage, related to climate change education and empowerment to better support the development of inclusive and equitable climate solutions. So Curtis, I think, and I think it was also built on, but this idea that we're not just looking at climate solutions, we're looking at equitable and just climate solutions, which means exactly what has already shown up. But the how can this happen? I think let's dig into the more there, because I think we've alluded to it. Well, let's go deeper. Anybody want to jump in first?
Sure. For me, I think the how it's kind of focused in the transformational journey around intentionality of equity, inclusion, diversity, and injustice. And this idea of it really taking place at an individual or interpersonal level, an institutional level, and an industry level. And so understanding that, as individuals and as institutions, we have to put in the work ourselves. That's the time, that's the resource, that's the money to develop those foundations internally to ensure that our approaches to any type of external work that we're doing is done so in an equitable and inclusive way. And part of that is through listening. When we think about, community engagement, the first thing that comes to mind is that community members are experts in their own space, right. Both from a context and from a content perspective. And, we have to continue to take the time to learn from them, what their issues, what their concerns might be, and how we can collectively come together to address those. And the other piece here that I think is really important is, continuing to take the time to build transformational relationships and not just transactional ones. In a transformational relationship, I firmly believe that both parties, both individuals, they learn and they grow, and they do that together. And that has to be the mindset that we have going into this work.
Well said, Curtis. Well said. Others want to build on that?
Sure. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Kristen.
No problem. Curtis, I really appreciated what you just shared. And one of the things, as we started looking at the future of informal science learning and science engagement, that came out of our conversations with our member institutions was that we couldn't separate the taking on of these grand and global challenges like climate from the work that our institutions are doing to become more welcoming, inclusive, and anti-racist organizations. That one couldn't succeed without the other. And so I think there are a set of field-wide supports that become necessary to support the development of inclusive and equitable climate solutions, because it doesn't just emerge when we know that we have systemic inequity built into science engagement as a field. So for example, there are support systems like the Cultural Competence Learning Institute, which is a program by museums for museums to support organizational change around becoming more equitable and inclusive, to actually learn some of the listening skills that Curtis mentioned, to practice those, and to work in partnership as some of the institutions on the line here today, like the Wild Center, practice. So the support there isn't how do they engage on climate. The support is around, becoming a more inclusive and anti-racist organization. But there are also models and approaches that we know are more community-centered, that center listening, that share power. So I think a sister part of this is about identifying the models and approaches for community-centered science work that can be scaled when institutions are ready to do that work, right? So when those internal skill sets, those internal culture shifts and power shifts have happened, there are models that can be turned to, whether that's the public dialogue and deliberation style programs that David leads, or the community-centered citizen science versus the researcher-centered citizen science that Jeremy and David have engaged in, the co-creation, co-design, co-development work that Wild Center leads. So while we are in one pathway, building more inclusive organizations, I'm hoping we can also be intentional about capturing the models that organizations might turn to when they're ready to use them. Because some of those are much more effective than putting information on an exhibit wall. And so getting both captured, the processes for organizational change and the models for community-centered community science, I think will let us make more progress quickly, given that we do have some bright lights to draw upon.
Perfect. Well said. Others?
I'll chime in just to emphasize two things that were already said pretty, I thought, ably by people before. One is that just leading with the science is not always enough here. In the informal science education community, we're increasingly thinking about connecting science content to the broader societal context. And you heard a little bit about that really powerfully, I think, from Curtis and Kristen and others. And the idea behind that, in terms of how we do it with climate, I think, is that we engage our audiences about what we all need to know to identify the problem and potential solutions, but we are sort of, upfront and explicit that every possible solution has societal and ethical trade-offs, and that those need to be considered through the lens of a diverse range of stakeholders. And so we spend a lot of time trying to think about how do we get people to think carefully about that. And we spend time co-creating questions and agenda for discussion in the way that I think Billy and Curtis were both talking about, so that the work will be relevant to decision makers and community stakeholders alike, and that they're viewed as equitable and informed by diverse voices through this kinds of co-creation process. And at the center of that is this explicit idea that everyone has valuable and important information and perspectives to share, and that societal decision-making will be enriched through the inclusion of those perspectives. It's not a, do you consult these people or not to do something or not? It's how do we create the solution that is going to sort of increase the benefits for everyone and distribute them equitably in a way that reduces negative consequences for as many different people as we can possibly imagine by getting their perspectives from the ground floor.
Absolutely. Jen?
Yeah, thanks. I think Kristen and certainly David just mentioned this, but this like shift in power, and I think oftentimes museums hold a lot of power. They have staff, they have these buildings, they have the way to get funding, and then when you're entering into these relationships with community-based organizations or Native communities, I was thinking about in particular, there is thinking about that, how does that power shift and change so it is really equitable and it is really co-created, because that's a very difficult thing to step back and let those other voices make space for other voices in a really authentic and I guess beautiful way. I mean, it's a really difficult, it is a really hard thing to do. And so I wonder, like, as we're thinking about inclusive and equitable climate solutions, we also have to think about how the funding streams are coming in and where that money is going and who's holding the money and like whose voices really are at the table and where that, and where that power is that power structure can be very subtle, but it can be very profound. So having having some a dashboard or a lens to kind of look through that. And I think, Kristen, you mentioned the Cultural Competency Learning Institute that's run out of the Children's Museum in San Jose in partnership with Aztec. That is a really that's one of the more powerful mechanisms, I think, in helping science centers and other museums sort of like take a step back from holding that power so tightly to them, from mostly a dominant culture perspective.
Really important contributions. Billy or Jeremy, did you want to add something here?
I'd be happy to add a couple of things. I think, what Jen was getting at around power, I think is, I think in a way, before you can sort of jump to like, how do you do this? You have to understand some of the things that prevent you from doing this well. And I think the power imbalances, whether it's between a big science center and a small community organization, or between a city agency and a group of, folks in a neighborhood, like those power dynamics are really important to understand, and how they can potentially be barriers, and how then there's the question of how you overcome those barriers. And I think, so power is one. I think trust is another. I think often places like science centers and city agencies and so on assume that they have the public's trust, or public health agencies assume they have a community's trust, but that is an assumption that needs to be checked. And if there's not trust, it needs to be continually built and built upon. And I think that's not a trivial matter. I think negotiating power and trust is not a trivial matter. And a third point, I think, is around, and Kristen referred to this earlier, was around kind of alignment of values and priorities and mission. And I think often it's easy to assume that everyone has similar concerns. But I know one thing that we found when I was at the aquarium in Boston is that, we wanted to focus with community organizations on climate, and they were focused on housing. Like that's what, now obviously there's an intersection between climate and housing and resiliency, and it's really important, but you can't just start from where you are. You have to understand where all your partners are, whoever it is that you're starting this organization. And I think that there are skills, I think cultural competency is one frame. I think, another frame that we worked with some was around kind of community organizing, which is not the same as education, which is not the same as outreach. It's a really very particular set of skills and activities that some people really know how to do. And we actually hired someone who had a community organizing background, and she made an enormous difference and just operated in a very different way than people who were sort of coming from an education outreach engagement perspective. So I think being open to those different kinds of skill sets and approaches is really important. And I guess the last thing I just say is I think it's really important to kind of broaden the conversation beyond simply science centers, and community organizations, which is like an incredibly rich area. I have a lot of hope for, but really to think about for city agencies and neighborhood groups and other organizations that are more sort of scientific or technological or technocratic or engineering oriented, and how they relate to broader community groups.
Really important point. Jeremy, you got anything else you want to add here? All right, cool.
I just wanted to add really quickly about systems. That another thing that's really important, and it's been hit on as well, is this, the idea that we have to continue to work across systems in ways that we haven't before. Overall systems of oppression, they don't operate in silos. And the solutions, some of these climates and community-based solutions are just, you have to untangle this just web of just systemic issues across many of our systems. So that can encompass, our environmental systems, our transportation, health, housing, economic, social. We have to think very differently from a very dynamic partnership perspective, how we address these very just systemic challenges. And they're inherently intertwined. And therefore, we have to approach them as such.
So, you know, I'm just, sorry, I'm just really glad that this is being recorded because you guys are on fire today. So I'll be listening and reading this transcript very carefully. So how can we better engage a diversity of local leaders and partners? I mean, this is flowing beautifully, right? Because this is exactly what we were just talking about through these types of organizations. But the other dimension of this question is really starting to get about scale. Kristen, you started talking about it and others have alluded to it, but you know, we have millions of learners, visitors that we're talking about and, you know, across thousands of communities, right? So if you look at the richness of communities across our nation, and these conversations are not just unique to the United States, these go worldwide in some ways, but let's just zoom in onto the nation. There's still thousands of communities and millions of visitors and learners. So how can we better engage the diversity of local leaders through this work? You know, what are the needs to be done? Kristen, you actually went here already, and I don't know if you want to consider reinforcing some of those points, or if others
I might actually go a couple bullets down, like a sub bullet. How about that?
You go where you want to go.
So I think there are a whole lot of needs that the field of science engagement has, and we already started to touch on some of the supports related to racial equity, related to other systems of inequity that need to be combated, and to these individual institutions and personal roles in those systems. But I think those aren't the only barriers here. I think that when we look at views of climate, we have science engagement professionals who are encountering the politicization of climate, who are trying to better understand with the communities that they are engaging with, as diverse as they are, and as local and as specific contexts as they are, how to take on the complex topics of climate and climate science and individual and collective climate action in the context of a highly politicized environment. And so I think there are some additional skill sets here, like that can be fostered, that have to do with comfort with data science, that have to do with an ability to make use of the data and information that is available about local impacts, the research-based approaches to communicating about what we know about climate impacts, and to so many of the points that have been made on this line, acknowledging that those we are engaging with may actually know more about that than the science engagement professional themselves, may be living the very real day-to-day impacts that are manifesting in communities in a way that the science engagement professional isn't. Those are not necessarily engagements that, you know, whether it's an after-school program or an engagement arm of a science society or a science museum, that individuals have been prepared for. Those are really complex intersections of what we know about global change, what we know about the politics in responding to global change, what we know about the inequities of their impacts, combined into one. And so professional development for me feels strong here as a need. And along all of these lines we are talking about today, sort of taking on only one of these aspects will be insufficient for a whole system. Yep. I think the other thing that's on my mind here is about making these global issues more local. And, you know, Catherine Hayhoe is a powerful example that's spoken with the Aztec community of how to sort of put the person you're engaging with at the center of communicating about climate topics. Not all science engagement professionals have sort of come up with those skill sets. So it's very much on my mind that this is a complex intersection of points. We've only talked about a few of the barriers so far here today, but the more local, the more specific, and the more shared, and to Curtis's comments, the more ecosystem based, and by that I mean the full infrastructure of all of these entities working together, not viewing any one science engagement program as sufficient, are really systemic questions that require a national strategy. So I'm glad you are working on one.
Agreed. Billy, given that Kristen just went a place that you've spent a lot of time with professional learning and cohorts and informal education, you want to go next? Feels
Sure.
like a natural.
Yeah, I think professional development and I think that and Kristen alluded to this earlier, the development and kind of scaling up of evidence-based practice is really important. And I think the kind of community of practice model is one really important model for that kind of joint professional learning that's not simply just about sort of transfer of skills and knowledge, which is certainly important. But there is sort of this art of practice that, I think has been fostered among various, grant-funded programs and, association, kind of driven initiatives by, Aztec and AAM and AZA and others and so on. I think the concept of a real systems-based approach is really critical here, I think, and thinking of that system in a larger sense than just the system of education. And I guess one model that stands out for me, and I may have to rethink this a little bit given what's happened over the last the last half a year, but I've had a lot of respect for what happens in the public health sector as kind of a community-based interface between kind of technical science, medical knowledge, and the public. And the way that I've seen people in the public health field, that I've worked with people at Boston Department of Public Health, for example, and they are really expert at figuring out how to identify who the community is, who the community trusts, where the power sits, and how to negotiate and organize people toward a common goal. Whatever that public health challenge is, whether it's about increasing climate resiliency to urban heat, or whether it's dealing with a disease outbreak. And unfortunately, I think what's happened is that that sector has really been starved of funding, but it really does exist at so many different scales. I mean, every local town, municipality, city has a public health department, and that scales up to the state level, and that scales up to the national level in various ways. The American Public Health Association is an incredibly powerful organization that brings together that kind of expertise on a national basis. And so I feel like there's a lot to learn from public health as sort of that scalable model that is able to operate from a very local scale to kind of regional to national, sort of despite the kind of disarray, dysfunction we've seen in the COVID pandemic. I think there's a lot there to build on. And I think that both directly partnering with the public health sector and also learning from that model is, those are a couple of really important opportunities to think about.
Awesome. Others, anyone else want to build on this?
So I think that there's a lot of, so this goes back to, I think, our idea of like, or the conversation around like understanding like where the science center's, power and privilege lies, and then really doing in some ways like, a power mapping exercise of the communities that you wish, like, here in Richmond, Virginia, for example, there's a very strong and storied and celebrated urban agriculture history to the city. And it's predominantly been run by an individual named Duran Chavis and several other of these local community gardens that have been kind of started and then integrated into a city program through the years. And, it took our desire as an institution that wanted to connect climate change to our community was recognizing that we needed to show up to these spaces, not in the sense of, can we hold a meet? Like, I just want to come and hang out. And I think what our institutions in some ways fail to do is to recognize that there are other groups that are currently doing stuff that we can help amplify and say like, oh, and hey, did you know that this rain barrel is actually a climate resilience strategy? You know, and then all of a sudden the urban agriculture program now advertises the fact that they can use and generate, you know, stormwater credits for the people that contribute through harvesting and reusing rainwater. And so I think of it as like, we need to recognize that there are local leaders, and we don't necessarily, it's not so much like, you know, we might have a grant and it's like, you know, it's going to be 2 years and I need you to be involved in my program. It is like meaningfully developing a relationship with the organizations and partners and leaders that are already doing things. And then without it feeling like, you know, the Science Museum has to be the lead, you know, the star of the conversation. And I think that that's like, it's really that humility and recognizing that we can help amplify and augment an existing mission in our communities instead of trying to kind of railroad it with like, climate change is important, you know. And I think you've heard that from a lot of the people that have said that they been speaking today. I want to be explicit in that, like, you know, it has been after hours, beyond my 40-hour time, and several of my colleagues at my institution, we recognize that you have to put in time in the community in order to serve it.
That's a really great point.
Just to build off that, I have to find the link to the study, and I'll definitely send it out. But 2 years ago at the North American Association for Environmental Education conference, one of the keynote speakers talked about a study that had been done surveying organizations around partnership building, with the understanding that the challenges that we face as a society are very intertwined. And it requires very dynamic partnerships to address them. But when we think about partnerships, you know, we have to change as individuals and institutions to go into those partnerships in an effective way. And that can take time. And they came up with these 4 network principles. And I tend to refer to these a lot, and they really resonate with me. And many of them, other panelists today have really hit on extremely well. And, you know, one of them is mission, not organization. So the idea of what's your overarching collective goals, aside from what your institution might be seeking to do or accomplish. The other one is trust, not control. So that goes back to some of those power dynamics that we talked about earlier. Power sharing, you know, how are we maintaining and building that trust and letting go of some of that control that is inherently there. Humility, not brand. So, you know, I think going into those partnerships, going into this as in a learning process, right? That we're not where we want to be, and that's okay. But we have to go and do that collectively. And the last one I enjoy the most is the idea of building constellations, not stars. So as organizations, we're all intertwined in terms of the role that we play within our systems. However big or small, we're looking at our systems in scale and scope. And, you know, we have to look at, you know, the idea of knowing when we as an organization, what's our niche, what's our role? Where do we step in and also even more importantly, where do we need to step out in terms of the work that's being done in any different community setting?
I really love that framework. So please, Curtis, please share that report or that paper. David, do you have anything else you want to build, or is it's all here?
I think a lot of it's said. I'll underscore one thing. I mean, there's been some great discussion in the last couple of minutes about this. I think I really resonate with Jeremy's comments about not just thinking of this work as a project that can be accomplished in a particular case. And I think the Wild Center is just such an exemplar in this work. We need to go from thinking of projects that need to be accomplished to tools, practices, strategies, and partnerships that everyone can use and leverage to do the service for the world that they need, and that science centers are an example of an organization that needs to be of service, right? And so we can think of that as, you know, we decide how we're going to use the library and how is going to be the best thing. We need to think about how to do that. And I think I totally echo what Kristen said, that I'm really excited that you are thinking about this. The Clean Toolkit is a great example of where, you know, there's a shared list of resources of great things people are doing. And when I look at the participant list of this group, there are some fantastic people listening right now that have created wonderful tools that all of us would benefit from. And none of them are perfect. None of the things that we have are perfect, but they're all things that we can use in trying to establish these partnerships.
And David, let's always remember, good on time is always better than perfect late. You know, so we're always learning and growing. So, you know, man, these slides just couldn't go any better, guys. You guys are hitting it hard. But, you know, as I'm hearing what you're saying, and it's really impressive. But one of the things, especially when you start thinking about these ecosystems or those constellations, as you said, Curtis, one of the and then the duration it takes to build them. You know, this idea, whether it comes out of the collective impact model with a backbone, but there's an entity that usually is able to do the long work, build the common agenda, and build the continuous communications. And so, you know, that's what I've seen. But, you know, these needs for organizations, whether it's businesses, local governments, NGOs, nonprofits, education groups, et cetera, community-based organizations, to provide coordinated support for or by, you know, I'm going to make a slight edit, these community-based engagement programs. So, you know, give me some thoughts about that, about the role of that. How do you build that ecosystem? Because, you know, grants, they come and they go. I mean, I've worked with these forever, and, you know, 2 years, 3 years, and then, you know, you move on to the next thing. A lot of times, the people that are on this panel have carried across the same mission, the same work across multiple funding activities. I'm looking at all of you and I'm like, yep, you guys are here because you've been able to thread something across that was common and important, as opposed to you did a project and then you were done and then moved on to something else. That there's a difference here. And so talk to me a little bit about this importance of this coordinated approach. Anybody can start.
Well, yeah, so something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is how to make, so one of the other things about the organization, institutional power and privilege, is that we have, you know, multiple people that might be working on a grant proposal, for example, or multiple people working in our grants office or in like the financials, but small community nonprofits likely do not. And in fact, many of the ones that we work with only have 1 or 2 people on staff, but they have extremely important reach around the community that we're seeking to serve with any one given grant opportunity or whatever it is. But we can, if we figure out a way to make that's like a really streamlined way for the money to, you know, for us that has the privilege and power in order to get the grant, but then ease of distribution and limited needs for reporting on the side of the community organization that we're working with. And I know there's been some improvements to that through the types of, like, is it a subcontract, you know, a contract, a subaward, or a stipend? But I think streamlining that across all the different funding avenues that we can go for, like, does the Department of Forestry or the U.S. Forest Service that, you know, has heat island mitigation money, can they also allow the same ease of straight line for the community organization to get the support without it needing like them to invest a bunch of their time on the reporting and things like that? And I understand that that's like, you know, there's rules and regulations, but this is the time to be wondering, are those rules and regulations set up to benefit those who already have the power and privilege and disadvantage those without it?
Really important point. Others?
Jeremy, I think it was important that you shared sort of how the money flows being one of the important power structures we're talking about here, and you're not alone in being at an institution that is thinking about how it can move from simply having that money flow happen in its walls to actually enabling more small nonprofits in the community to make progress towards shared goals. Frank, you were talking a little bit about collective impact, and there certainly are models we know are more effective for collective impact than others, and none of them are easy. And if any of you have joined a collective impact project, you know that the proof is in not just the backbone organization, but shared metrics of success and data sharing and the fiscal agency that Jeremy is talking about and so much more, I wanted to call out the fact that we have levels of government mentioned here, in that there are some interesting plays being used by the university community in the form of university-led grand challenge efforts. They're attempting to get universities, nonprofits, community organizations more integrated into local government and state level efforts around topics including climate resilience and response. And I think it's interesting for us to look beyond informal science learning and engagement to see if there are models like that we can draw on, because for some universities, those approaches have been really critical to allowing a cross-sector interdisciplinary approach to local geographic-based community progress on sustainability goals. And not easy, but there is sort of this connection point with state and local government that I think is important to keep on the table here.
Absolutely. Any other points?
I would say real quickly, one of the real challenges here, I think, in creating scalability and coordination and so on, is that there are some really significant kind of barriers to entry, I think, for, we talked about earlier that you need to have, for example, if you're talking about, science centers or museums or aquariums, whatever, you have to have organizations that have that level of kind of commitment and competency, to doing this kind of work and have the skills, you can't just replicate, programming or models without those sort of basic skills. And, Jen and I have worked on this around sort of youth engagement and climate. Like, you have to build on a solid youth engagement program. You can't, you can't build that on a bad foundation. That's not a strong, youth development program. So, like, similarly here, you have to have strong, if you're talking about science centers, you have to have a strong community, centered institution to build on before you can sort of create this sort of scalability and collective impact. So I think that is one of the challenges. That means that you need sustained effort over time. And I think, long ago in the Aztec Youth Alive initiative, that helped create a culture in the science center world of having youth programs that actually work and that actually outlasted individual staff. And the legacy of that continues today. And that's the kind of effort we need. That's like a 10-year effort, for example.
Right. If given, just I'm gonna ask permission for us to go a little longer. Anyone who has to drop off, that's totally fine, including panelists. But if you've got maybe 5 more minutes, we've got a lot to say. If you guys, we're just gonna go a little longer. Patrick, is that all right with you? Can you do that? Because you're our recorder.
Yeah, no worries. That's great. Perfect.
I appreciate the flexibility. This is really important stuff. So I'm just going to move to the next question because they're totally connected. And the funding piece, the longer I've done this, the more critical this piece is. If we don't get this right, everything else, everything we know needs to happen just won't happen as well as we know it should be. So, this idea of, especially now with all the deep economic impacts, and we're still not at the bottom of how deep these impacts are with the COVID response and the social, the economic challenges that are coming. That all being said, climate is not waiting for us to get our act together before we have to start making progress. This is a really tricky time, but increased funding or reprioritized funding, how would these funds be maximally focused in order to do everything we've been talking about here? And just I want to remind you that back in 2010, when Congress said to NOAA, NASA, and NSF to do climate change education, my tally is somewhere around $200 million were spent in grants. But it wasn't like, here's $200 million, go make progress on climate change education. It was, all these little projects all over the place. And I don't know if the conversation here is asking for something different. So if we were going to do something different, what would that be related to funding? That's an open question. Jump in.
I am always happy to jump in and talk about national funding sources for climate engagement. as Frank knows. Look, I think if there is an increased investment around this, we have to acknowledge a couple of things. One is that we tend not to think about strategies for science engagement at the national level when we take on research and science initiatives. We tend to hope that that manifests or defer to programs like broader impacts, which rely on individual researchers engaging the public in their work rather than a more systemic approach. And I think we've been talking here about the need for a more systemic approach. I would also note that in addition to that, we should really be looking at this balance of skill development and professional development, as well as expanding on proven models and scaling what we know has been effective, rather than funding a bunch of fresh starts. We have a clear sense of where skills gaps are in this work. And then the last thing I would say on this point is this is a time of crisis for science engagement institutions. And that does not just mean science museums. I do not know a single nonprofit working in science engagement that is not struggling financially and is not worried about the employees that they have either had to furlough or lay off. And that is a real loss of intellectual capital of those who have been doing this work and have built, a base of practice that the nation could be building upon. So I worry about going into a national strategy when the field is in such a time of crisis, and recognizing that operational recovery will be meaningful over the next couple of years, along with the equity impacts that we're seeing in how that economic crisis is manifesting.
Absolutely. Really important points. And then, Kristen, I would reinforce that we're not only talking about federal money here. There's a lot of, one of the things that's really shown up recently is the subnational investments in this space have been critically important, but they're actually hurting even more economically, right? So this is a broad strategy. I mean, everything you said is absolutely correct, and yet we have to persist and be successful. How is the strategy?
And I want to say thanks for having me. Unfortunately, I have to run. It's been a wonderful discussion all.
Thank you, Kristen, for making as much time as you could.
Thank you, Kristen.
Can I chime in real quick?
Absolutely.
So just to say 3 things from my perspective that build on, I think, some of the great stuff we've heard earlier. First of all, I think it's important for us to remember that sometimes the revenue topics sort of is around things like health or housing dimensions rather than the dynamics of the problem or even of the solutions themselves. And that requires flexibility from experts and funders. And I think the only way to get them on board, because they have priorities that matter, is to actually embed them in these processes as participants. We have to let them understand the affordances and see the knowing nods that you get from participants as they go through these, and the learning that happens, even if the learning is not couched in the framing that we ourselves bring. The second thing I would say, and I know there was a lot of discussion about this, but I think it's worth repeating, is that I think it's really important to make sure that funding allows for early buy-in from these kinds of partners we're talking about, industry, community, civic, and for sustained involvement. That's important because you don't want people to feel like, oh, the money ran out, we're gonna get it all worked out on the next project. That doesn't work for some of these partners for reasons that Jeremy and Kristen and others talked about. And so that's important both for creating action and also maintaining a level of trust. And so from the funding perspective, to me, that means that you need to have people that say, we're in this for a while. We're in this for the relationships, not just for the numbers that you get for how many people are engaged this quarter. That's hard to do, and especially in the current situation, but I think it's very important.
Completely agree. Jen?
Yeah, I just echoing what David just mentioned is like there is the institutions that are giving funds. I mean, we have to address the structural racism that is embedded in those funding mechanisms, and who's setting those guidelines and who's setting those timelines, and who's like all of those structures were created, not in an inclusive process, and they don't allow for communities, for disenfranchised people to be centered in them. They're just not set up that way. They're just not set up that way. Most funding mechanisms are not. And so how can we like help to push that, to help rethink the way those institutions should be operating and how they should be thinking about funding, and the way, you know, I know so many small organizations, they don't have grant writers, they don't have anything that could help them actually even apply for funding. So there exists this like huge inequities that have not, anyway, we could talk for a long time about this, but like in order to sort of think about how to build an inclusive process in which we are actually bringing a lot of this work to scale, while at the same time leaving that flexibility for it to be deeply rooted in place and addressing community values and centering and having the community be a partner and co-creator in it. We have to look at those sort of root challenges with that funding mechanism. And David's comment around like centering the funders in this is I think really important, because I think funders are actually ready and willing to have those conversations now for the most part.
Right.
Or hopefully they can be.
Well said. Curtis, do you have anything else you want to add here?
Yeah, I think just to add on to what has been said is we have to understand the current disparities that in terms of who's getting money and who isn't, and really understand, you know, again, like how those systems were built, and looking at those processes. What are the requirements? What are the things that are being tracked? How are they being evaluated? Who's setting those guidelines, as was mentioned earlier as well. I think the other piece that's a part of this too is we have to look at kind of the comprehensive kind of larger scale funding plans, understanding that this work overall takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, and making sure that any groups that are working in this space are looking at what that continued investment looks like. And that's something that's built over time and has to be intentionally discussed to ensure that there's that sustainability in the efforts that are happening. So I think someone mentioned earlier that it can't really be that project by project approach. Like it's got to be looked at a much larger continuum or a much larger scale.
The longer I've done this, that last point you just made, Curtis, is the length of work, right? It's been said a bunch of times already in this conversation, but I think that is one of the quickest structural changes, not discounting the structural racism that's already built into the funding, but just the duration of work is one piece. And then you have these other pieces that come with that. Wow. So in respecting time, Curtis, did you have another point you needed to make there?
Yeah, and I think similar to what we were saying earlier about organizations really needing to do that introspective, internal-based work, funding organizations have to do that too. And so for example, I actually sit on a diversity and inclusion and equity committee for a regional funder. And those are conversations that you've got to dig into to understand, you know, those policies, practices, procedures, as they currently are, and what are the things that need to shift. And also understanding what your goals are. I think that has to be a really important conversation, not just even internally, but with your stakeholders, to understand, you know, to make sure that you're being inclusive of your process, of the changes that you're seeking to make.
Awesome. So we're already 9 minutes past. Closing thoughts, anything we should have talked about that we didn't, I mean, we've only got 3 of our panelists left. We've lost 3, so we're down to half, but any closing points for the record?
I've just got one to throw out, which is that I was thinking that we may be better off with starting with some sort of large scale program model that then individual organizations and institutions can partner with in some way. And I think about something like, you know, 21st Century Learning Centers, or a program like, you know, AmeriCorps, where there's like a programmatic structure, and then, you know, people can partner and work with it in different ways, but it starts with that sense of scale. And I know there's been a proposal for some kind of climate core, you know, as something for the next administration. I don't know the details of it, but it just made me think about, oh, well, that may be a really different way of thinking about this. and to start with that kind of structure and build in the supports for, you know, equity and social justice and so on from the start, and then create opportunities for you know, organizations, initiatives to partner in some way. And I thought that might be a really different approach. Somebody raised the question, what's going to be different this time? That, you know, and I thought that might be a really different approach that could be interesting.
What's interesting about that, Billy, is unfortunately, there are a lot of my partners across the country who are furloughed. And so, you know, bring that talent back into the community work through something like that, as opposed to trying to do it institutionally across. It's a really interesting idea. I think it's definitely something the community should be considering and thinking through the details and how would it actually work, but that's a great point. Any other points that want to be made at this time? Wow.
I think that I have a comment, and I think I just want to go back to something that Katie Boyd said at the very beginning in the chat around making sure, I'm trying to find your message, Katie, but it was essentially about how are we through the ACE strategy project, like how are we engaging and, you know, starting here with us, listening to communities and organizations, like how are we doing that? So I know you weren't able to follow the chat, Frank, because it was coming fast and furious. And Katie, I don't know if you're still on, if you want to jump in and ask your question in a way that I'm not, I think I kind of butchered it, but because I can't find it right now.
No, I think that's exactly what I'm
Thank you.
And I just think there was a lot of discussion today, and this is going around in general too, around, you know, how do we center these voices of folks that maybe are normally not privileged in this space. And we talked about how museums can leverage their privilege to help community organizations. And I was just kind of trying to throw out there for ACE to think about, you know, having this, and I know you're still doing more listening sessions, Frank, so maybe you're already planning it, but, you know, engaging with some of those community organizations or, you know, climate justice folks, and having a listening session with them to get, you know, directly their voice instead of sort of this, you know, being the only way that we talk about this.
So one thing that's as we've thought about this whole process is what we're doing right now is building to the strategic planning framework. How would you go about building an ACE national strategy, not doing the ACE national strategy? So if we actually go for a full, robust, true, complete, who knows how we're going to do it, ACE national strategy development process, probably in the next administration, then that is when you would do exactly what you just said, Katie, because I mean, Curtis, I think you've said it really, really well, that you would do it. This can't be done for the communities, right? It has to be done with the communities. And so I think that's when I would really think about that process. But your point is really important because the strategic planning framework calls forth, you must and should and would be advised to do X. And then the doing of it is when you would do that probably in January on. That's just my thinking right off the bat. I don't know if others have, but there's a big step between the framework, which is what we're doing now, and the actual strategic planning development process. I think that what you're talking about is in the second phase of things. But we're going to also have community review, but there's more people who've been in the work as opposed, and they've brought that experience, like the people in the panel, but not so much the community members, but they may come in, but it's an interesting point.
I think
it just gets complex.
Yeah, sorry, and I know we're way off on time. I just wanted to add to Katie's comment or her question that, and being part of, I mean, full disclosure, I'm on the strategy team for the dialogue. So it's something we've been talking about a lot. I do think that I think that it's really important. And I know that, you know, Frank and others on the team feel the same, that we should really look hard at the process, and if we're going to go through the listening sessions like we have today, that we've done previous ones, that climate justice one, maybe we need to front and center that in a way that we haven't done that yet, and looking to figure out, like, what does that look like, who should be invited. The process might look a little bit different because it's we're centering different voices. Like having done a lot of work with the Haudenosaunee community, I know that they would structure these conversations in a really different way. And that, you know, if we were to like sort of take on, and we should, centering that community within these conversations, that actually it might just like blow our perspectives like a little, you know, which is coming from a very certain dominant perspective for the most part. You know, it's going to really change it. It would be so different, like really different. So,
and that's all I think I was trying to say, is that some of those may bring something that we wouldn't necessarily think of. And, you know, I think Frank brings a really good point that there are sort of two stages of this and engaging within communities, but I do think it's important to have voices or somewhere in the mix of this, you know, just for example of like, if your A strategy talks about how to engage K through 12 students, you know, and then somebody from an Indigenous community finds that doesn't work for, you know, like that's not the way to engage their community, and then they're not represented in there. So it's just kind of trying to make sure that some of those voices get into some of these other conversations, even at the beginning.
And there was really an effort, sorry, one last thing, and then I'll stop. Taking up space is that a number of years ago, IML, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, sponsored a meeting called iWise, which was primarily an Indigenous-led conversation. It was in DC, and it was really based on sort of the Indigenous perspective on federal funding, and like that the way that the federal funding system, this is probably again a whole other conversation, but like was really not set up for the way in which Indigenous, and again, this is from that specific perspective of folks in that room, that it's not set up in a way that kind of honors their process and timelines and way of thinking, because it's completely different from our Western perspective and Western approach. So, and I know there's been some changes, at least within IMLS, to kind of honor that more, but there's so much work to do. So, I also think it makes it a much richer conversation too.
Thank you, Jen.
Of course. Okay.
Burning desires, anything that must be said for the record, or we can just let it be here?
I have lots of thoughts. There's lots of good stuff. But I got to sign off. So.
Yeah, thank you. Patrick, if you just stay on for a second so I can get the chat so I can actually read it.
Yep. And I'd love to just check in for a second if you have.
Yeah, just click absolutely. On the three dots next to your name in the chat. You can save it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I'm about to do that. I'm going to stop sharing. So thank you, Curtis, Jen, and Billy. Thank you also, David, and you know, Kristen and Jeremy, who are not here with us anymore because we ran long. But there was a rich conversation. Really important things were said today. So thank you for sharing your time and with all of us.
Thanks, everyone. Really well done.
Thank you all. Thank you, Curtis.
Thanks, everyone.